Good afternoon, everybody. My name is J.R. Ross. I'm editor of WisconsinPolitics.com. Thank you and welcome. Thank you for participating. Welcome to our post-primary virtual luncheon on races for governor, U.S. Senate. Thank you to our sponsor, ARP Wisconsin. Thank you to our panelists, Emilee Fannon, CBS 58, Lou Jacobson from Washington with PolitiFact, Sabato's Crystal Ball, U.S. News, senior author of the Almanac of American Politics, and Jessie Opoien from the Capital Times. Welcome, guys. Appreciate your insight today. I want to talk about the governor's race first, and I guess I want to look ahead and look back. So my first question looking ahead is to throw it out to you guys. How will Tim Michels navigate the Donald Trump factor between now and November in Wisconsin after he obviously rode that endorsement, at least in part, to his victory on Tuesday? Who wants to go first?
Well, Jer, I'll start because I was at Tim Michels' campaign on Tuesday night, his watch party. The biggest thing that I noticed is that he only thanked Trump for his endorsement. He didn't talk about election integrity. He didn't talk about any of the falsehoods about the 2020 election that Trump has constantly talked about and pushed some GOP lawmakers towards decertification. And his tone was more shifted towards jobs, the economy. So that I thought was the first sign of Michels trying to distance himself from Donald Trump. Of course, also yesterday, we had Governor Evers launch his statewide tour, attacking Michels and really trying to tie himself to Donald Trump. And I think that's going to be a reoccurring message that maybe if Michels doesn't want to talk about Trump, Evers is definitely going to be hitting him for his ties because, of course, Michels got that Trump endorsement weeks before the primary.
So, Jessie, I mean, there was this little kind of pop-up thing where Michels scrubbed Trump from his website, then added it back in sometime yesterday. I mean, is this more of Michels trying to walk that fine line of Trump, or what's going on, do you think, with him and this dance with the former president?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that he's brought up, every now and then on the trail, and I assume he'll talk about more is that, he says there are Democrats who want to vote for him. He says there are blue collar Democrats who say the party's left them. They see him as, an advocate for the working class. If that's going to be the case, I don't see a lot of those Democrats, wanting to embrace a Trump candidate. So if he really is trying to capture some of those votes, he's probably going to be, like you said, kind of doing that dance, right? Because it is an asset, among some Republican voters, but it's certainly not going to get him any crossover votes.
But it also seems like Republicans have been hoping to win back suburban college-educated women in Wisconsin, at least in Milwaukee, for example, Milwaukee area, talking about inflation, talking about crime, talking about grocery prices. But if you have the Trump endorsement as a big piece of this, and you have Michels endorsing the 1849 abortion ban, I've heard the kind of thought that it'll be tougher for him to win back those voters than if that weren't factors. And I'm curious, Lou, with you, what are you seeing nationally from candidates for governor, Republicans who have the former president's support? Are they running on it or running away from it? Are they trying to keep him at arm's length? How do they navigate in other states besides Wisconsin?
Yeah, I mean, we're at kind of an inflection point now because the primaries are ending and the general election is about to start. So I do think that some of the candidates that the GOP voters have chosen in primaries are going to have to decide now how much they try to boost their support from the base by continuing to be strongly pro-Trump versus trying to reach over and maybe get some Democrats by distancing themselves. And because we're not quite at Labor Day yet, that point hasn't necessarily come, but it's going to be a big question. How, if you're more concerned about making sure that you unify the GOP base, or whether you maybe try to reach out. It's a great question, and I don't think we know the answer to that yet.
Okay, so I want to flip a little bit though. Evers is going to try and tie Michels to Trump. Michels is going to try and tie Evers to Biden. So I'm going to start with you, Jessie. If you're Michels, how are you successful in making this a referendum on Biden, which probably helps you? And if you're Evers, how do you referendum on Trump, which probably helps you? How do they do that?
I think if taking Michels first, it's all about the economy. It's about inflation. It's about gas prices. It's about how do you feel when you go to fill up your gas tank? How do you feel when you look in your wallet? On the flip side, with Evers tying Michaels to Trump, I think I think it will, not that Trump really talks a lot about abortion, but I do think that abortion is going to be a thing that that Democrats try to hammer Republicans on. But it's elections. I mean, it's the fact that everything's still stuck in 2020 or even 2016, and I think a lot of people want to move forward, and I think that's probably what the message that you're going to hear from Democrats.
Emilee, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, kind of going back to what I already saw, I mean, I think Michaels is already changing his tone. He's not on the campaign trail yet. He doesn't have any planned events. We don't know if he's launching a statewide tour. I'm assuming that will be coming in the next few days. But all we really can go off of is what I heard in his victory speech, which wasn't anything about what he said on Friday, even at the Trump rally. My number one priority is election integrity. Then on Tuesday, he said his number one priority is jobs and the economy. So I think he's starting maybe to realize, or the people in his inner circle are saying, all right, maybe the Trump endorsement helped us in the primary, energized a lot of rural voters, but let's move on from that. Let's talk about the bread and butter issues, healthcare, crime, the economy. We've talked about this too, Phil, your groceries are going up. That's what's going to connect with more voters. And I know we'll talk about the abortion issue later, but did it drive out Democrats in the primary? Sure, I'm sure it did. It really energized people, but is that going to matter come this fall? Is that still going to be top priority when voters go to the ballot box in November? Because we don't know. I mean, a lot of things can happen. When does that lawsuit challenging the 1849 abortion ban come out? When does it go to the Supreme Court? Or is inflation going to get better? There's a lot of unknowns as we head into this fall.
So Lou, I had a Republican argue to me this week that if November's a referendum on Biden, Republicans win. The referendum on Trump, Democrats win. Now that's probably oversimplifying things, but I assume if Trump announces between now and mid-October, he injects himself into November. What else is going to make this race about either Trump or Biden, not just Wisconsin, but nationally for voters?
Yeah, well, I mean, if this were a typical midterm election, it would be all about Biden. It would be a referendum on him. I think, though, that Trump is such a huge figure and is everywhere. I mean, even if he doesn't officially get into the presidential race, it's still going to be about him to a significant degree. I'm not sure necessarily that the decision of whether to run for president being announced, before the midterms is by itself going to be hugely important, because he's already so well known and such a factor. I think that the search warrant on, his home has certainly brought him back further into the news cycle. And so you are seeing evidence, and partially this is because of the abortion issue, which we'll come back to, but partially because Trump has had, not a great summer. He's had the whole January 6th committee hearings with sort of drip stuff about January 6th. And now the search warrant, he is in the news. It's not for things that are flattering. His supporters are certainly going to paint him into a martyr. So, it could very well, energize the GOP base in a way that they weren't necessarily before. But I do think that there are these cross-cutting pressures. Democrats have been able to sort of separate themselves to a certain extent from Joe Biden. You're not seeing a lot of these Senate candidates or governor candidates with 40% approval ratings like Joe Biden has. So there is that difference. Part of that may be because a chunk of the people disapproving of Biden are Democrats who are not happy with him because he didn't do enough. And so that's not something you can hang on a Senate candidate maybe who's not even in office, or a gubernatorial candidate. So this is shaping up to be more of a complicated political environment than one would have thought even a couple of weeks ago. It was looking like inflation, the economy, and Joe Biden's unpopularity were really pushing towards a red wave, which would not be surprising because that is a common historical dynamic. But the kind of reinsertion of Trump into the discussion and the reinsertion of abortion into the discussion has, on the margins, helped Democrats. And it may not save the House for them, but it could make their lives a lot easier this fall.
I gotta admit, maybe it was the caffeine, lack of sleep, but it crossed my mind at some point on Tuesday. Did news breaking of the Mar-a-Lago raid do anything to voters, especially Trump voters, on Tuesday, right? Because it seemed like I had heard that polling showed Michaels is up about 8-9 points at one point this summer. It had narrowed, which is obvious because he went negative. Club for Growth actually went negative on Clayfish. Then he wins by 5 points. Again, could be just paranoia, lack of sleep, but something drove Trump voters because he did well. He did better expected outstate, I think, by big margins and cut into the Clayfish margins in southeastern Wisconsin. So I guess go back to our Wisconsin panelists. I want to ask you guys, what turned the results on Tuesday in your mind for governor? Was it just that he did? How did he do better in southeastern Wisconsin? How did he cut into the Clayfish edge we thought she would have, a la Leah Vukmir on Tuesday?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right that Mar-a-Lago played a role. That really, I think, lit a fire under a lot of Trump supporting Republicans. And you saw Michaels hammering that message. You saw most of the communications that he sent out on election day were referencing Trump and talking about Mar-a-Lago, talking about the endorsement, talking about the event. As for southeastern Wisconsin, though, that's a mystery to me at this point. I'll be honest. I really don't know what happened there.
I would agree with Jessie about the southeastern Wisconsin. Clayfish, I thought, kind of mapping out how both campaigns, where they were going in the final days. Clayfish was hustling those suburbs, also knocked on more doors. I think she was around 70,000. 23,000 was where the Michael campaign, that was in total. But it felt like she had a little bit more help on her team, and she was in those areas really trying to connect with voters. But it clearly, I mean, we've also seen some of the headlines. Was this the end of the Walker era? I mean, the Scott Walker, who I'm referring to, the former Republican governor who was on the ticket with Rebecca Clayfish. I mean, are people just tired of the same old, same old? And that's what I heard from supporters at Michael's campaign watch party. Of course, I was just only there, so that's only a small few that I talked to, but it was not so much about Trump. Of the people I talked to, they didn't even want to talk about Trump. Actually, they were there because they love the outside image, the businessman coming in, but that's kind of what we saw Trump run on, right? So it is kind of two political figures that are running on similar platforms, but we'll see if Michaels kind of keeps Trump by his side, or if now he just still sticks with the outsider. I'm not a politician. That's what I think worked for him in the big versus the established candidate versus the outsider.
I'll say too,
go ahead, Jessie.
Going back to the Trump rally, which Emilee and I were both at, it's only a sampling of people there that we got to talk to, so everything's anecdotal, but the handful of people that I did speak to who were actually there for Michaels and not there for Trump weren't necessarily, they support Trump. They were, would probably vote for him again, but they weren't really happy with a lot of the things that he was saying. They weren't happy with him going after Robin Buss. They weren't happy with him hammering on decertifying the election. So, I think it's interesting that Emilee said folks at the party didn't really want to talk about him either.
Yeah, well, to the realignment issue, I mean, you go back and look at Scott Walker and how he did in 10 in Waukesha County, how Leah Vukmir did in 18, and how Rebecca Clayfish did in 22. There is a downward trajectory. So I am wondering if there's a realignment in Republican politics in Wisconsin, where we've gone from a Walker, the cheesehead revolution, right? A decade ago was Scott Walker, Paul Ryan, and Reince Priebus. Now you have Walker couldn't close the deal for his former running mate. Paul Ryan was booed at the rally on Friday that Trump had. And Reince Priebus was perceived as being kind of not on the Clayfish team this election, right? So there's been some kind of turnover in Wisconsin politics. My question is it a lasting one? Is it all about Trump? Are we seeing the blue collar voter in Wisconsin move toward Republicans because of Trump? And are they going to lose then college educated voters going forward, which is a dynamic we're seeing nationally? So I'm wondering, Lou, like, is Trump any different in Wisconsin than other states that you look at, or is it the same thing across the board of how he impacts elections?
I mean, I think you see it everywhere, and I think Wisconsin is part and parcel of that. You know, in 2020, Trump did not do as well in the traditionally Republican suburban Milwaukee counties as his predecessors not in the GOP presidential races did. And you're seeing very high levels of support in more rural areas with less college educated people. So yeah, I think this has been a consistent theme across the country, and I think that the state of Wisconsin is definitely part of that.
So some of the Senate race, there wasn't really a race this week. It was pretty much over right before Tuesday. I would have loved to have seen a contested race, not just because it's better for my subscribers and my content, but because I would like to have seen a true measure of enthusiasm for Democrats and Republicans, right? I mean, Republicans turnout was up in their primary versus years past. Democrats had 500,000 people vote in a race that was pretty much over 2 weeks out. So that was kind of interesting, but I don't know where the parties are in terms of enthusiasm, though we see, Lou, let's talk about the national signs. We saw special election in Minnesota, a 10-point Trump seat 2 years ago, 4-point win. The Kansas vote, a special election somewhere else that was closer than we thought.
Nebraska.
Thank you. I get the impression if gas is $5 a gallon in mid-October, Democrats are screwed. If it's $3, okay, they got a fighting chance. That's oversimplifying things. But what is happening? Is it just inflation? Is it abortion? What is happening that is changing the Democrats' fortune right now, which I was going to impact Mandela Barnes and how well he can do against Ron Johnson?
So there are a couple of factors. I think that the more modest factors are that gas prices have been going down pretty quickly, not to the levels everybody would like to see, but it is an improvement. It's not continuing to go up, and it's not continuing to be at $5 a gallon. And you know, job creation is still strong. Despite the question of GDP growth being very sluggish, if not negative. You know, I think that, you know, on the margins for more clued in voters, the fact that Biden has been able to pass a bunch of things in his agenda, which he had not, you know, the like news stories have been for a year, you know, Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, blocking Biden agenda, going nowhere. Well, you know, he is about to sign in a couple of days, probably, the last major bill before the midterms. He signed a bunch of other things, including the bipartisan gun control bill. So there are some things that, you know, will these necessarily fundamentally change viewers' feelings about the president? Not necessarily, but at least it kind of stanches the bad news and the sort of feeling that he's like, you know, overwhelmed by the job. So it sort of takes the pressure off a little bit. But I do think that the biggest factor is the question of abortion. There are, I did a piece, I'm trying to remember exactly how many states it was. There are like about 18 states, I think, that have bans on abortion, most of which do not have exceptions for rape and incest. Some of them, as in Wisconsin, are old laws being put back into place. I know there's a legal process that has to go on first before that happens, but there are a lot of states, including a lot of battleground states, where basically the rubber's really hitting the road now for voters. If you care about abortion rights, you really, like, now is the time to get active. And nowhere is this truer, with the possible exception of Michigan, maybe, than the state of Wisconsin, because you have a GOP legislature that is very solid, based on how all the lines have been drawn. So there's no chance, at least for now, of Democrats flipping it. You have a law that is ready to go in place to ban abortion. And all you've got as your last line of defense is the Democratic governor. So if you care at all about this issue, even if it's not necessarily the first issue, it's a pretty big motivator to go out and vote for the governor who's going to prevent the sort of worst case scenario in your mind from taking place. And if they come out to vote for the governor, then they'll vote for other offices as well. So there's probably a benefit down the ticket as well. This is the kind of calculations that are going to be going into play in a lot of states. Not the very red states, not the very blue states, because the blue states have already guaranteed abortion rights. But there are a lot of states from Arizona to Michigan to Wisconsin where it really is a sort of final struggle on this issue. And I can see why voters on the Democratic side would be very energized. And that's not something that would have been an obvious scenario prior to Roe v. Wade being overturned. In a midterm election, usually your base, if you're the White House party, is kind of demoralized. And now there's a real chance that they will be fairly energized.
So Emilee and Jessie, let's talk more about this issue. So I had a male operative, by the way, tell me about a month or so ago that, whenever I hear people in the lobbying community tell me in Wisconsin, oh, abortion is not going to matter, they're often men. I do get the impression it's a different perspective for female voters. And I've had some female operatives tell me, look, we don't expect to change people's minds about this issue because of Pat with Dobbs. But we are feeling is that women who would before just go out and vote regularly are now saying, I'm going to vote, but also I'm going to call a friend and I'm going to volunteer to come make calls. So maybe that's the impact. What do you guys pick up in your reporting among Wisconsin voters, like how this is impacting them?
I think that's that's spot on. I think among certainly Democratic women and probably some more moderate women, it's more of a motivating factor than it is for men. I mean, it just is. And there's not. I would have been interested, I guess, to see how this played out differently had Clayfish won, because she had the unique perspective of being a woman who opposes abortion, who could talk about it in a way that was personal, and maybe mitigate that effect a little bit. Now that you've got two men running, it's just a little bit of a different conversation. In the Senate race, I think Mandela Barnes has definitely prioritized this. He released that ad with his mother talking about her experience with abortion. And I think, making it personal is the way that it becomes more effective. And he's been able to do that, I think, somewhat effectively so far.
Even with my conversation with women my age, women even older, even being at all of these abortion rallies after the first leaked opinion, there's a lot of women telling their stories for the first time. And I think when they go get coffee, go to the brunches, even in my conversations, people are kind of talking about really difficult times that they went through, maybe personally getting an abortion or something happening and having to have a medical abortion if it was an emergency. So I think that has been resonating a lot more. And if there's a man in the household, oh, my mom went through this, or she's talking about this, or maybe one day I'm young and my girlfriend gets pregnant. I want to be able to have options. We've talked about that. So I think young voters, it's going to matter, but also older women are talking more about it, their personal experiences. And so I think that energy is still good right now among voters. And that is also maybe why we saw so many Democrats turn out despite the U.S. Senate field being completely cleared essentially for Mandela Barnes. I also think, bringing up Kansas, voters rejecting that referendum. I mean, of course, it's a red state. Trump won it, I believe, by about 15 points in 2020, and yet voters rejected it. So it wasn't, of course, all women that went to the polls. I bet there's some men that just felt that was a little too extreme to completely ban abortion. So we'll see kind of just watching to see where that energy goes. And I know I mentioned this earlier. I think it's all about the timing of this lawsuit. I mean, if the state Supreme Court takes it up, of course, it has to go through the lower courts, but we ultimately know as political reporters where most of these cases end up is going to be with lies in the hands of the state's high court. And if it comes a ruling in October, I mean, you betcha Wisconsin voters are going to be pretty amped about that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jessie.
I think, there's also an interesting dynamic at play because you do have, voters who are my age, Emilee's age, who have only grown up knowing, the post-Roe world. But I've talked to older women who are saying things like, we saw this fight, the first go around. We can't believe we're going through this again. And they're motivated in ways that they maybe hadn't been before because they thought, they know how we got here and they knew it took then to get here. And I think, I've definitely had some older women who remember what it was like before reach out and talk about being a little more motivated in ways that they hadn't been before.
I just have wondered, if you're a Democrat, how do you turn that feeling about abortion, not just into a vote on abortion, but a vote for a Democratic candidate, right? Or is it, do voters are happy about that stay home? That's their protest? Because I don't know if you can just get somebody to vote only on that issue. Say, you know what? I don't like Evers on taxes. I don't like him on the environment. I don't like him on crime. I saw Kenosha and all that stuff, but I'm gonna vote for him because of this. I don't know if you can turn it into it, but that's gonna be the challenge for Democrats. Now in the Senate race, challenge for Johnson is his numbers aren't really great. Marquette poll, which we've looked at every couple of months for the last several years, they're pretty mediocre. Now, they were mediocre in 2016, but by now they've begun to stabilize and his positive numbers were going up, not quite now, but like a little bit later on, his negative stayed where they were. I haven't seen movement upward for him yet. We see a new poll on Wednesday. How's he get reelected if his numbers are that bad? How is that pop? The New York Times headline was what? How is this guy so competitive despite everything? I think the Johnson folks are not very happy with that headline in the New York Times. But that said, how does a guy with numbers like that get reelected in this environment?
I think in general, he's just popular. I think regardless of the controversies, the headlines, his conspiracy theories about COVID that he's made, and just some other snide remarks about the codifying the gay marriage bill, kind of flip-flopping on those issues. I just don't know if his supporters are reading those headlines, nor do they care. He's a very popular figure. When I've gone to other Trump rallies, even though he hasn't been on the ballot, on Friday too, he got a huge round of applause, even though he wasn't at the Trump rally. I think he's just a favorite. And I think it works among Republican voters. They like to maybe, look away from some of those headlines that he says, or that he makes, I should say. But I think he's just a powerhouse in Wisconsin politics. And I mean, we'll see what happens in November. Of course, there are two very different candidates running with Mandela and Ron Johnson. But I think he's strong in here. And I think his supporters are not really distancing themselves quite yet.
Jessie, what do you see in that dynamic for him?
Yeah, I mean, he's always made headlines. He's always drawn controversy. It was for things like, sunspots, as opposed to, COVID or January 6th. So maybe the stakes are a little bit higher now, but I mean, he's always drawn controversy and it hasn't really affected him. If you talk to people who do support him or who follow that, they say people just like that he kind of tells it like it is, doesn't really want to be there, doesn't like Washington. And it obviously continues to be more difficult to distance yourself from Washington the longer that you're there, but he's always done a pretty good job of that. And I think he kind of continues to walk that line of saying, look, I'm here, but I don't really want to be here. And I think that kind of works.
So Lou, how is Johnson viewed nationally? I mean, I've read the Cook Report and other Sabato's crystal ball, the ratings for this race, they're either toss up or lean Republican. How is it that it's that dynamic when he's tied with Mandela Barnes in a poll from Marquette about a month ago? Is it just the fundamentals of the environment, or is there something about Johnson in particular that makes him a survivor?
So I would emphasize that everything I've seen in the ratings has been that it is a competitive race. It's not off the table. It's not one of these like, lightning has to strike for him to get voted out of office. I think probably if it's toss up to lean Republican, a lot has to do with the fact that he's the incumbent. He is well known, a lot better known probably than Barnes is, although that'll change after the TV ads go up. He's been elected twice, kind of come from behind victories both times, in a very challenging state for either party to win. You see, Wisconsin, compared to other states in the country, has the most divergent set of senators, Tammy Baldwin and Ron Johnson, really on opposite sides of the spectrum. And so he is somebody who has beaten the odds in the past, and I think people are kind of loath to write him off at this point anyway. If we see his support crumbling down the stretch, it's a different story, but I think right now it's kind of his to lose, and he could lose it, but I think people are being cautious before they sort of write Johnson's obituary. So
what does Barnes have to do to win? Like, what is his path to victory with that dynamic?
I think he needs to define himself and not let himself be defined. He needs to sort of portray himself as a likable, approachable guy who is not as controversial and will not embarrass you, like say Ron Johnson might. And he has to make Johnson's traits and background, be essentially at issue here. Johnson's got the record to run on, and I think Barnes has to make it about Johnson while making sure that he doesn't allow Johnson to portray him as like being on the loony left.
So Emilee and Jesse, I picked up after the dropouts of Nelson, Lazary, Galewski, the sentiment was nobody would throw a punch at Barnes in the primary because, one, there wasn't a great punch to throw in a primary. Yes, you have the Abolish ICE t-shirt. Yes, you have various comments, but they don't play well in Democratic primary. Two, the best punch was electability. Hard one to throw against the statewide elected official who happens to be black, by the way. Really tough in a primary to make that punch. But that those punches will be thrown starting now until November. How does Barnes beat back the negativity about these things, like, being late on his property taxes, right? The parking tickets that led to his license being suspended, if I remember correctly. Just how does he counter that narrative that he's not up to the task of being a U.S. senator?
And we've seen him, I think, start to attempt to do that by sort of making that an issue of relatability, saying, I've struggled. I didn't pay this thing. I've gone through the struggles that you're going through. I understand, that we're not all perfect kind of situation. I think those attacks might not be as effective as, the ones that we've already been talking about, the Abolish ICE, being sort of linked to the squad, the farther left elements of Barnes' history. I think those are more effective attacks than the personal things about, a property tax and unpaid parking ticket.
Emilee?
I think the struggle for Barnes is to not, I would agree with Lou, not to completely just make it about anti-Ron Johnson. A lot of his commercials have tried to connect with voters that, I went, like what Jesse said, I went through the struggles. I believe he was also on Badger Care at some point. I think that message resonates a little bit more for him on the campaign trail. And I mean, of course, he's still, I think when people address him with these, the Abolish ICE, the Kenosha unrest, et cetera, even when I've asked him certain things about those topics, he always just makes the turn and shift. Well, Ron Johnson did this. So I think we're going to hear more from him instead of, okay, yes, that happened, but let's move on. We should be talking about Ron Johnson's controversies. Look what he did. Look what he voted against. I think that's what we're going to see more of, because I've already heard it from him. But yeah, well, I guess we'll kind of see if he changes his messaging, but I think he should still just try to keep that connection with also younger voters. I mean, he's 35. He's running up against someone who's double in his age almost, that might work a little bit better.
One thing I'm fascinated by is, Evers and Mandela kind of made themselves the odd couple at times, right? This unique friendship as they ran together. We've only had a black candidate top the ticket in Wisconsin twice, right? 08 and 12 of Obama. It's the highest turnout that I saw in Milwaukee County for obvious reasons. Mandela running number 2 in 18 didn't really jazz up Milwaukee. Now that he's number 1 on the ticket, will that have a benefit for Evers? Now a challenge for Barnes is going to be, how is he going to play out state, right? We have you can go into all kinds of layers of what's happened in Trump years, right? With how voters view people, but how does he sell himself out in outstate Wisconsin? Try to make a pitch on ag issues, rural issues, we're talking those up, but I think it's really going to be a unique thing for him. How does he play out state? And can he really jazz up Milwaukee and get it going? Speaking of outstate, 3rd Congressional District, Lou, everybody's written off that seat as the most likely to flip. How does Brad Pfaff keep that seat in dem hands when most folks are saying it's Derek Van Orden's to lose, at least nationally? How does he pull that off?
Yeah, I mean, it's really tough because, demography is destiny these days in politics. And the demography in that district for Democrats is not looking good long term. What he has to hope for is that the same kinds of patterns that were evident in the Nebraska race and the Minnesota race, those were sort of similar kinds of districts, pretty small town and rural areas, and the Democrats significantly overperformed in both of those, and also Kansas as well in terms of the abortion, the ballot measure. He's got to be hoping that some sort of mirror is going to be happening in Wisconsin in his district come fall. It's a lot to hope for, but I think that's their main chance.
So I've been told that House Democrats are trying to avoid not just losing the House, but the bloodbath. So they're investing in holds. They're not, so the 1st Congressional District of Wisconsin, which is now basically a 50-50 seat, they're not going to invest in taking out Brian Stile. Do you think Brad Pfaff can make a good case to Nancy Pelosi to invest in his race? It is a Dem seat, right? But it's 50-50 and trending away. Can he make that a convincing argument to invest here?
I think it's harder to make that argument if it's an open seat. If it's a sitting member, there's a lot of personal loyalty that the Democrats are going to want to invest in. And if it's an open seat, it's somebody new, untested. I think it's a lot harder to make that argument.
So Jesse, I'm curious your thoughts about, it's obvious Democrats want to disqualify Derek Van Orden, right? So the January 6th thing, the part from his book about exposing officers' genitals to female subordinates, the library thing, is that it? Is there anything else they can do to try and disqualify Derek Van Orden in your minds?
I think that's it. And it remains to be seen how effective any of those things are. He's a dynamic candidate. He's got a lot of national support. And I'm not sure what else you throw at him.
It's also, like we've talked about how that congressional district, yes, is kind of 50-50, but it has been trending a little bit more Republican. I think it's just going to be an interesting race to watch. I don't think there's anything other punches you can throw at Derek Van Orden, but let's get them in a debate, right? I know us political wigs love watching that. It's what else can Brad Pfaff, run on besides his record, short time, in the state Senate as well. So we'll see. I mean, when they get on the stage together, is it going to be throwing punches, or is it going to be talking about rural issues and their voter base?
It seems like Brad Pfaff's been trying to goad Derek into a Twitter fight. Mark Pocan seems to have an ongoing feud with Derek Van Orden for whatever reason on Twitter. I don't think they'll enjoy each other if they're in the House at the same time. So I want to move on to some questions we got submitted from the audience ahead of today, and start with you, Lou. So is there any indication that the information coming from the House committee on January 6th is going to influence voters?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that the 30,000-foot view is that most Americans' minds are made up about Trump, positive or negative. and nothing will move him off of that. The closer view, the 1,000-foot view, would be that it may not cause, a lot of Republicans to suddenly say, okay, well, after 5 years or 6 years now, actually, I don't like Trump. It's more the question of, okay, given the party's need to look ahead to 2024, is Trump our best possibility? And so more of a soft erosion or a backing away, and thinking, maybe there's somebody else in our party who could do a better job and actually win in 2024. It's just that sort of slow grind of like, he's always in the headlines, he's always making news, it's not flattering news. Can we move past this? And it's going to take a critical mass, and it's going to take leadership of the party to actually move past Trump if they're going to do that. Right now, I don't see it happening. I'm not saying it's never going to happen, but I don't see it happening right now. In fact, if anything, the search warrant has probably, re-energized the GOP base, and they're now standing up for him even more than they were a couple of weeks ago. So, I think that the January 6th committee will not do it on its own. It's doing an important job documenting history, et cetera. But as far as changing the political dynamics, I don't see dramatic changes coming out of it.
Emilee and Jessie, have you talked to any voters who bring this up to you or are raising concerns who aren't core Democrats?
No, this is something that Democrats want to talk about, and most Republicans that I've spoken to either don't want to talk about it, or it's just not a concern. And I think, Lou's right. People's minds are made up, and the way that you feel about Donald Trump will shape the way that you feel about January 6th, the way that you feel about that committee. And I think, we have to assume, based on this week's election results, that people are energized by, the search warrant at Mar-a-Lago. They are seeing Trump as more of a martyr figure, I think, in a motivating factor than something that they want to shake off.
It also, what I'm watching for is, what does January 6th committee do with all this information? Of course, Lou mentioned, yes, they're documenting it. They've had a lot of prime time, committee hearings at night when people are at home eating dinner with their families. I don't know any Republican that had it on during that time that I've talked to, at least. But what do they do with this information? Are we going to be seeing this in more negative campaign ads? We had the image of Donald Trump basically not wanting to say we can't overturn the election. There was that video of him kind of changing his tone multiple times. That's come out. And what happens with this raid? Of course, people are protesting outside saying we support you. I mean, people are energized. I think that did play a factor on Tuesday with that happening just before. So that's kind of what I'm watching for. I mean, what do they do with the information? Where are we going to see it? Is it still going to be fresh in people's minds? But even national polls, most people have their mind made up of what happened that day. And I don't know what's going to come out of it. But instead of just trying to remind voters, look what happened, here are the images, I likely feel like we could see them in campaign ads, but remains to be seen how much it energizes people.
So one of the questions from the audience was about how much influence third-party spending will make in these races. We had a luncheon with the state party chairs a while back where one predicted $700 million being spent in Wisconsin this fall. I saw a tweet this week. There's already been 126 million, give or take, committed on TV to the U.S. Senate race. So Lou, these numbers stop meaning anything at some point. Where is it all coming from to drop that much money on a race for governor or Senate in Wisconsin?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. Did they say the breakdown between the governor and the Senate?
That was just no, 700 million. No, they didn't give us a breakdown. It gives a round figure for everything.
Yeah, well, I mean, from the national perspective, the Senate, 50-50 Senate, it's on a knife's edge, and every single seat matters. And as one of the top 10 or even fewer seats that are really up for grabs this cycle, Wisconsin is right up there, and it's a state which has historically been very narrowly divided. It makes sense that if you're going to spend money somewhere, you get a lot of bang for your buck in Wisconsin. It's not the only state where that's true, but it's certainly one of them. And the governor's seat being open, I mean, you got a Democrat in the office. Any Republican who wants to really change the agenda really wants to knock out the governor, because you got a strongly GOP state legislature. So yeah, it makes total sense that they would be spending a lot of money. If you're going to spend money in politics, you can make a lot of impact by spending it in Wisconsin.
So one of the questions also is, did Trump endorsements help or hurt candidates in Wisconsin? So we talked about Michaels. We have to talk about Robin Vos. So I would argue that if you have a longtime speaker, the longest serving speaker in Wisconsin history, who has a phenomenal reputation for doing constituent outreach, who between him, members, staff, and lobbyists, he says did doors in the district 3 times for the election, had 150 grand in expenditures on his behalf, 30 grand for Adam Steen, and outraised Adam almost 2-1, but won by 260 votes. I mean, Trump had to have been a factor, but what else may have driven that result in your minds?
I mean, yeah, Trump is huge, but tied to that is that, so much of the election decertification movement in Wisconsin is coming from that part of the state. It's coming from, that the activists who are really pushing that, or most of them are based around there. And so they're motivated, and they were energized, by Trump. And I think by their frustration with, again, the legally impossible task of decertifying the election, they're frustrated by inaction on that, regardless of whether, that action would actually do anything.
I think people were also going with the Michaels message that, he's an insider. He's been in office for too long. People always tell me when the whole Toss Voss movement started, and there was that big, of course, debate during the GOP state convention about that. Some people also just say, well, when he had the chance, when Governor Scott Walker was in office, they didn't do more to ban abortion. They didn't do more on our policy issues that they could have done when they had in full power. So that also, I think, had a weight to it beyond the, of course, Voss standing up against Trump. I mean, Trump was slamming him to the point of bullying him on his social media platform, saying, he's going to lose. He's not pushing hard enough for decertification. But, credit to Robin, he stood his ground. He said he's not going to do it. There's no legal pathway to decertify the results at this time. And I think that, of course, upset a lot of voters who are still very passionate about it. And we saw the turn of the man that he hired to launch an investigation into the 2020 election. I'm talking about former Supreme Court Justice Michael Gableman, turned on him as well. So you have Trump turning on Vos, you have Gableman turning on Vos just days before Tuesday's election. I don't know how big of the base Gableman has. I mean, I think in the last polling, not a lot of people knew who Mike Gableman was or this election investigation. Of course, Gableman makes headlines. We write about it all the time. We are paying for his bill. Taxpayers are paying for this review. So I think it's, to Jessie's point, in that area, that was an issue that mattered. Trump completely changed that race. And I think it shocked a lot of us reporters too. 260 votes. I think it was Paul Farrow, GOP state chairman too, saying he doesn't think it's going to be, competitive. And that was a big shocker. So I did talk to also Paul Farrow Tuesday night when he went to Michael's campaign. And he said, I think this just sends a really strong signal that we need to get back to work. We need to start uniting the party, because this was very surprising.
So I want to piggyback off of that comment to Lou. Look, Trump endorsed candidates have obviously won the primaries in Georgia, in Pennsylvania, governor's race in Arizona. They're also coincidentally not doing very well with the general public right now. What I want to ask you though is, are you seeing any signs of the Trump supporters in states where his candidates lost are just tuning out? Like, is there energy going to be there among his supporters if it's not a Trump candidate on the ballot in November?
That's a great question, and I think it's right now. I don't think we have enough information to know. I track. I just had a piece come out today in Sabato's Crystal Ball tracking the 27 Secretary of State races across the country this cycle. 10 of them are solidly Republican, 7 of them are solidly Democratic, 10 are ones I consider competitive. A majority of those 10, 6 are GOP nominees of the Trumpy variety, of the election denier variety. In a couple states, Georgia's one, where a mainstream candidate, GOP candidate, won the nomination, defeating a Trumpier candidate. That was also true in Colorado. And I believe you could say even the Secretary of State doesn't have anything to do with voting in elections. In Wisconsin, it was the relatively establishment candidate who did win, it seems like, in the Secretary of State race. Those are the exceptions. You're seeing a lot of extremely Trumpy candidates winning in states like Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, and Michigan, and a few others. In a lot of these key battleground states, there will be a very pro-Trump aligned candidate, at least one, if not more than one, on the ballot. So the question is it's not even going to be a question because there will be those candidates. It's an interesting question to think about whether there's some sort of downside for the GOP in having a more mainstream candidate in states like Georgia and Colorado.
Since we're talking about Voss, I got to ask Jessie and Emilee this one from a reader or viewer. How manageable would a 2/3 majority be for Robin Voss in the assembly? Because you have the option that even if Evers wins, right, you can negate him, but you'd have to keep 66 Assembly Republicans together on every vote. Is that likely?
I think it's a challenge. I think we've seen, the larger the majority has grown, the more fracturing we've seen within it. And I think looking at the results of Tuesday night, we're only seeing that, those more and more of those fissures emerging. So I think it's a huge challenge if you've got a large majority, because it's not the same Republican Party. There's warring factions within it.
We've already seen also a wide variety of opinions with the caucus too. I mean, there's no consensus on adding an exception to the 1849 abortion law. Robin Voss, I think, has even said that it's not an issue where there's an agreement on also decertification. There's, I think, I can name about 2 or 3 state lawmakers in the assembly that are completely anti-Voss, but are there more? I don't know. He's going to be caucusing on Tuesday, I believe, with his members about ending the Gableman investigation. Does that help him? Does that hurt him? We'll see. I mean, he clearly won his primary. He's probably taking a sigh of relief right now, but he's got to face the facts going forward and trying to bring his caucus together on past, trying to tout their conservative values, what they've done so far. Here's our record. Here's what we tried to do that Evers blocked. And this is what we can do with a Republican governor. It's just kind of bringing everyone together after a primary election and saying, let's do this. Let's start energizing our base.
This was a little more in the Emilee, Jessie wheelhouse again, but it'd be a very short answer, I think. Question: if Evers wins re-election and Republicans retain the majorities in the legislature, what's likelihood of cooperation or reconciliation between those two parties? No. Okay. All right. That's what I kind of figured. No. Okay. Another reader question. So we saw in Virginia governor's race last year, the Democrats could not stop talking about Trump while the Republican candidates formed his campaign on education. Is there a risk to hammering on Trump for Democrats this year in Wisconsin, like we saw in Virginia?
I think there could be, sure. The question is, at the time in late 2021, Trump was relatively quiet. The candidate in Virginia really distanced himself from Trump, and Trump didn't really jump in and shout me, 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 me. With the situation now, Trump is in the news regardless, so the Democrats don't have to bring him up. They can still do whatever non-Trump messaging they want, but Trump will still be kind of in the ether. I think that's the difference between now and 2021.
Emilee and Jessie?
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's who knows what's going to happen, with the January 6th investigation and everything that's stemming from it. They don't have to bring him up. He's already going to be part of the conversation. But yeah, I think there's a risk to paying too much attention, because there are a lot of other issues that are just more, pressing, like how we handle pandemics, how we handle economic downturns, things like that.
Yeah, and I mean, we're going back to how Evers just almost immediately is going to keep trying to tie Michaels to Trump. Of course, there's always an opportunity that could backfire. But I mean, throughout his 4 years, he's been talking about the bread and butter issues that people care about. You're still going to have those voters. Well, you didn't get anything that you wanted actually done, but he's up against, a Republican-controlled state legislature. But he did have a lot of money at his disposal with this COVID funds. I mean, billions of dollars that he could openly put towards small businesses, a wide variety of things that I think before he knew his opponent, that's what he was on, doing. He was focusing on, look what I did for small businesses, look what I did over here. And that's what I think he'll eventually keep going in that direction, instead of just, it would not be a safe move, I guess, to not talk about the issues impacting everyday voters, even though he did firmly start immediately tying Trump to Michaels. And we'll see if that works, but I think he'll start changing his tone, down the road to talk about, inflation, the economy, even though he is up against that. I mean, he doesn't really have too much control on what he can do on the state level to control those things. But let's just, I bet he's just probably hoping grocery prices are down come this fall.
I think there's an interesting dynamic too. Most of his ads so far have been talking about working with Republicans, cooperating, talking about signing or the Republican budget. But I think another effective route for him is, talking about being the goalie and, being the only thing between, a lot of Republican policies coming into fruition. And so how do you kind of thread that needle between saying you're going to work with anyone who has a good idea, you're going to cooperate with anyone, but also saying I'm the last stop against these things that you don't want to happen?
So yeah, time for one more. I'm going to pose this one to you guys. Let's look at Tony Evers and Ron Johnson. So you have Tony Evers, who most polls, so he's likable. Maybe voters aren't enamored with his leadership style in terms of like being forceful, but they think he's trying to, he's a decent guy, right? Ron Johnson, quite a polarizing figure, both incumbents. In this environment, I want to take the option off the table of straight party ticket winning out. What is more likely? Ron Johnson and Tony Evers win re-election in an anti-incumbent environment, or both Mandela Barnes and Tim Michaels win in this environment? Even though they're incumbents,
yeah,
power incumbency.
That's a tough one. I mean, I think right now, if there was an election today, I don't think the incumbents would do as well. Just because what voters say is they want something different. They want change. I think that's what we saw in 2018 with Scott Walker. People were tired. They wanted someone else in there. But I think, we cover the governor quite a bit. Even a lot of people just call him boring. I think he has an ad saying, I'm kind of a boring guy, but, I'm going to be the one that's going to block any more further restrictions on abortion, changing our election system. I have vetoed those bills. I'll continue to do that. And then for Ron Johnson, I don't know. I think the energy is on the side of Mandela Barnes right now, but we still need to see how Barnes addresses a lot of the issues we were talking about earlier about the abolished ICE, unrest in Kenosha. How does he respond to that? How does he get back on message and connect with voters? But yeah, I think right now the energy is on unseating incumbents, kind of just what we saw on Tuesday, but we have a lot to go, so no one quote me on that.
Yeah, I'd like to get out of the prediction game at this point, but if I'm forced to choose, I would say, yeah, anti-incumbent is probably a more likely outcome.
So Lou, do you think nationally, I mean, the power of incumbency is huge, re-election rates, even in waves, is it still matter as much this year, or are we seeing this is going to truly be like a true change election with incumbents going out left and right?
Well, let me look nationally at the governor's races because they're kind of a good microcosm. One of the fascinating things that I came up with is that if you look at the 50 state gubernatorial approval ratings, Morning Consult does a 50 state assessment every quarter of all the governors and, for that matter, all the senators too. At a time when Biden's got like 39% approval, Trump is like 39% approval, Supreme Court is down, Congress is down, wrong number, wrong direction, number is very high. All but like 3 or 4 governors had their approval ratings above water, and like 3/4 of them were like more than double digits above water. So, you know, I think that points to a couple of things. One is the difference between gubernatorial races and federal races like Senate, where it's just about your state. It's not just about your state and also about the federal government and the direction the Senate or the House goes. Governors who right now are seeking another term, by and large, are getting pretty good approval ratings. And that's unusual at this time in general for politicians. Does that mean that they have a extra leg up going into the election? Probably. Could you conceive of somebody who is up by 10 points in their approval getting ousted? I guess so, but it seems kind of crazy. So it would not shock me if there's a pro-incumbent tendency, at least for the governors.
Okay. Well, Emilee, Jesse, Lou, thank you for your time. Thanks for everybody who tuned in. Thanks again to AARP Wisconsin. We appreciate your sponsorship. Hope you guys all have a great day and a wonderful weekend.